Thank you for joining and welcome to our webinar where New Zealand born wildlife photographer Francine Stevens will shortly give a presentation on this brand new, very unique and special tour. Wild Lens is fully compliant with UK travel regulation law. We went to great lengths to ensure this as we want to grow into a major player in the wildlife travel industry. This may sound kind of trivial, but a lot of companies are operating illegally and are not complying with UK regulations, which are some of the strictest in the world to protect your money and your trip. So when you pay your deposit to Wild Lens, it doesn't simply go into the business account. It goes into a dedicated trust account, which is looked after by a board of trustees. They will not even allow me to touch that money as director of the company until the trip happens. So if anything goes wrong with me or the people I work with before your trip, your money is fully protected and you would receive a full refund. When I founded Wild Lens Nature Tours, my aim was to create new and exciting tours, not just simply copy everyone else, which so many are now doing. Many of my tours are unique to us, and this New Zealand tour follows that narrative. Francine spent a long time travelling the south of New Zealand just to put this tour together, finding suitable accommodation, exciting and rare wildlife, and local operators who would help to make her dream tour a reality. Now we're ready to launch this trip next October, which will see photographers encounter some of the rarest species on the planet. And I am super proud and excited by what it's going to offer clients. So I'd now like to hand it over to Francine to begin her presentation.
Welcome. Apologies for those that were unable to join the call this evening. I have done a separate recording just now for you all so that you can access that. If you have any question or answers afterwards, then please reach out. We can happily set up a separate session for Q&A or follow up with you directly as well. So kia ora, I'm Francine, New Zealand born, and this is the beach that I grew up on. I'm a wildlife photographer, conservation storyteller, and I've had a career globally spanning innovation, with my most recent years working within the tourism and environment industry. But before I get into the presentation properly, I wanted to share a personal story with you. This was a memorable encounter I had as a young teenager in New Zealand, one that's stayed with me ever since. So I was 16, and a group of us were camping away at Waihi Beach on New Zealand's east coast. Beautiful, isolated, nothing much to do except explore at that time. So one morning before the sun was even properly up, we decided to hike over the headland to find these sea caves that everyone had talked about, caves that opened straight out onto the ocean. We had one torch between the lot of us, one torch, 6 overconfident 16-year-olds, and a kilometre of dripping, echoing rock ahead of us. Probably not a bright idea, but it seemed like a reasonable plan at the time. We went deeper. The light from the entrance disappeared behind us, and the torch beam started to feel very small against a very large darkness. And that's when we heard it, this enormous guttural growl echoing off the cave walls from somewhere close by. Every hair on my body stood up, and someone whispered, "Seal." And that was that. We didn't discuss it, didn't vote on it. We just ran, scrambling over wet rocks. The torch was swinging wildly, trying to get out before whatever it was decided to introduce itself to us properly. We burst out into the daylight. Our hearts were hammering and stood there catching our breath. But nothing followed us out. No enraged bull seal came charging out of the cave mouth, nothing. So slowly and with considerably less bravado, we crept back in. our eyes this time adjusting instead of relying purely on one torch. And there it was again, that same enormous growl, bouncing off the rocks, sounding for all the world like something that could take your leg off. Except this time we actually saw it. It was a penguin, a little blue penguin about the size of a bag of sugar, standing there absolutely furious that 6 enormous teenagers had inconsiderately wandered into its living room. Not just any penguin either. This was the world's smallest penguin species and was making more noise than anything else in that cave. It gave us one more disgusted growl, then shuffled straight past our feet, waddled out the cave and launched itself into the sea to go fishing for the day, as if none of this had been remotely dramatic. And that's the thing with wildlife encounters. You expect the drama to come from big, dangerous animals, but sometimes it can be a sugar bag-sized penguin, the big character and energy, standing its ground in a cave that ends up being the story that you tell. I'd seen little blue penguins out on the water when we were out in the boat or bobbing about offshore, tiny little dots on the water. I'd never once imagined the noise that those things could produce, or that a bird smaller than a rugby ball could put the fear of God into a group of teenagers in under 3 seconds. I'll tell you about the tour itself near the end of the presentation, but before I do, I wanted to share a few more stories and photos like this one about the wonderful birds we have in New Zealand and the conservation work being done to protect them. This is in the hope that they inspire you as much as this little blue penguin inspired me. So New Zealand sits on its own, right at the bottom of the world. To put that isolation to perspective, New Zealand's nearest neighbour, Australia, is still about 1,300 miles away across the Tasman Sea, roughly the same distance as flying from London to Casablanca. And that isolation is really the whole story, because for roughly 85 million years, since it split away from the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, New Zealand has been on its own evolutionary path. No one else was invited to that. As I mentioned, this is my home. I grew up there and I've had the privilege of being part of its landscape and its wildlife my whole life. So everything I'm about to tell you isn't really theory for me. It's the place I know best in the world. And what that means practically is this. When land masses are connected, animals move between them. They compete with each other and they adapt to pressure from predators. But New Zealand never had that. For most of its history, there were no land mammals at all. No rats, no cats, no stoats, nothing hunting them on 4 legs, not even snakes. So the birds, insects, and frogs, or tuatara that you see here, they were already there. They just simply never developed the instincts or defenses to deal with a predator on the ground. Some birds stopped needing to fly altogether, as you might be aware with the kiwi. And some nest on open ground as if nothing in the world could possibly want to eat them. And insects even, they filled roles that elsewhere were played by small mammals. Some grew to a size you'd genuinely find alarming. The frogs even are some of the most ancient and primitive on Earth, barely changed from millions of years ago. So for millions of years, nothing threatened any of them from the ground. That single fact is why New Zealand ended up with somewhere in the region of 80,000 species found nowhere else on Earth. Not rare, not endangered somewhere else and doing fine here, nowhere else, full stop. I won't go into individual species right now, that's coming later, but I want that number to sit with you for a moment. 80,000 species found nowhere else on Earth. And then there's the landscape itself, which is doing far more work than most people realise. In the space of a few hours' drive, you can go from subtropical coastline to temperate rainforest, to alpine mountains, to fjords carved by glaciers. And that's not an exaggeration for effect. It's genuinely how compressed the geography is. So if you're living in the UK, I think that could be one of the hardest things to actually picture until you're standing in New Zealand, the sheer speed at which the country changes underneath you. That variety is exactly why the wildlife is also so distinct region to region. A species that thrived in coastal scrub for 1,000 years has had to solve completely different problems, from one clinging to a mountainside to 2 hours inland. And for a photographer, it's a gift. Every valley has its own light, its own weather, its own mood, sometimes its own microclimate entirely. You learn out there to just stop waiting for good weather and start shooting the weather that you've got. I want to focus your attention on one stretch in particular, because it's where a lot of what I'll be showing you today comes from. And that's the corridor from Wellington down the Marlborough Sounds and Fiordland, also out to Milford Sound. This part of the country carries many, but not all, but many of New Zealand's most critically endangered species. And the reason is almost always the same one. Millions of years without predators left native species completely unequipped for what arrived with humans. First Polynesian settlers, then Europeans, and with them rats, stoats, possums, cats. For birds that evolved with zero instinct to run or fly from something on the ground, the impact was devastating. But here's the part I actually find really hopeful, because I believe that this is one of the most innovative conservation stories in the world. New Zealand has pioneered what's called predator-free restoration. So entire areas, sometimes whole peninsulas, islands, are fenced or otherwise cleared of introduced predators so native species can breed and recover without that pressure. Wellington, where we start the tour itself, is a remarkable example of this in action. A capital city where conservation projects have brought back native bird life into suburban gardens, something almost nobody would have predicted a generation ago. It's community-led as much as government-led. Ordinary people running trap lines in their own backyards, checking them on the way to work, planting natives, teaching their kids to do the same as well. And then further south, along that same Wellington to Milford Sound stretch, you'll find some of the country's most ambitious island and peninsula projects. Whole land masses cleared of rats and possums and stoats, sometimes for the first time in over a century. Species that hadn't successfully raised chicks in living memory are doing so again. It's slow. It seems unglamorous work, mostly trapping and monitoring rather than anything dramatic, but it's genuinely changing what's possible for wildlife. 20 years ago, conservationists had quietly written off, and now it's very different. I'd also be doing this story a disservice if I didn't mention the Māori perspective on all this, because it's important and it shapes how New Zealand approaches conservation in a way that's quite different from a lot of the world. Many of these species are considered taonga, a word that doesn't translate neatly into English, but sometimes sits between treasure and sacred inheritance. And with that comes the idea of kaitiakitanga, guardianship, not ownership of nature, but responsibility for it. People and wildlife aren't separate stories in Māori tradition. They're connected, part of the same whakapapa, the same genealogy. That relationship, one of guardianship rather than control, runs right through the way conservation actually happens on the ground here. So I studied in Wellington, and I wanted to tell you that what the city sounded like back then, because it's part of why this conservation story means so much to me personally. In the early 90s, kaka, featured here, one of New Zealand's largest native forest parrots, simply weren't there. They'd been locally extinct in Wellington for the best part of a century, driven out by forest clearance and introduced predators. And as a student and birdwatcher walking through those hills and the bush around the city, I never saw one, I never heard one. They just weren't part of my Wellington. They were reintroduced through Zealandia, the sanctuary I mentioned earlier, starting with a small handful of birds in 2002. And today they're back, loud, cheeky, genuinely common across the city. A few years ago, I stood in the bush not far from where I used to walk as a student and heard that unmistakable call echoing through the trees, the one that simply didn't exist there when I was young. It's hard to explain what that does to you. Hearing decades of quiet, unglamorous conservation work, seeing that pay off in real time in a place you thought you already knew completely. For me, that's my why. That's why New Zealand. An isolated ancient landscape that built something found nowhere else on Earth, wildlife that's now facing real and imminent threats, and a country and its people responding with the most inventive conservation work, all of it underpinned by a much older idea of guardianship. I hope you now understand this place a little more before I start to introduce you to some of the wildlife that I enjoy that lives there. So New Zealand and its outlying islands are home to more species of penguin than anywhere else on Earth. The penguin capital of the world. And that's something people are always surprised to hear, given that most of us picture penguins clustered together, standing in large groups on ice. Ours don't. They come ashore into the forest, tussock and scrub. But out of all of them, there's one I want to spend real time on, because it's the one that reminds me the importance of how we watch wildlife. The hoiho, the yellow-eyed penguin, is one of the rarest penguins on the planet, with sadly a continued downward trend currently. For context, there are fewer than 115 breeding pairs in the last count this year, remaining of one particular subspecies we will see on the mainland. There are more in some of the remote islands. Its Māori name means noise shelter for its loud call, but don't let that fool you. In person, hoiho are shy almost to a fault. Unlike nearly any other penguin species, which nests shoulder to shoulder in noisy, packed colonies, hoiho nest alone, deliberately out of sight of their neighbours, tucked into coastal forests where nobody, not even another penguin, can see them. That solitary nature means seeing one properly takes real patience. You don't get to walk up to a hoiho. This is the one time in the Wild South trip I'd be asking you to bring out a longer lens, because it's also the one time I'll be asking you to keep your distance. Most of what we'll encounter on this tour will let us get remarkably close, and you won't need a long lens. But hoiho are an exception, and for good reason. A stressed hoiho will simply turn around and go back to sea and leave a hungry chick behind. So you find discreet sheltered spots to hide, and you sit and you wait. And eventually, if you're lucky and quiet enough, one comes ashore after a day fishing, waddles up the beach, up the hills, hikes up through those hills, through the tussock, and gets on with its evening, completely unaware or unbothered that you're there. There's a stillness to that kind of watching that's entirely different from spotting something from a moving vehicle. You're not collecting a sighting. You're quietly present in someone else's evening routine at a respectful distance. That's what I want for you on a tour, not a checklist. I want you to have experiences and to experience that feeling. From the smallest to the largest, out on the water, this is where the real scale of New Zealand seabirds hits you. We'll be out on the boat a few times for this one, because you can get closer to these birds at sea than on the mainland. And New Zealand is the world centre of albatross diversity. And on a good day out on the water, you can find yourself photographing half a dozen species within the same hour. The royal albatross with its 3-metre wingspan, the wandering albatross, wider still and one of the largest flying birds on Earth, and a handful of what we call mollymawks, the smaller albatross bullers with that striking yellow striped bill, selvins and the black-browed. Each one flies slightly differently, banks slightly differently, and once you've had a few hours of photographing them side by side out on open water, you start to pick out the differences. Also out on the water, you'll get to know the giant petrel, a genuinely enormous seabird with a reputation as the ocean's cleanup crew. We won't be looking for them on the beach. We'll be watching for them work on the water itself, gliding low over the swell or gathering in numbers around anything worth scavenging, squabbling and shoveling, especially near fishing boats, doing the unglamorous work of a functioning ecosystem. There's nothing dainty about a giant petrel. Watching one out on the open water is a proper reminder that not everything in nature is necessarily always designed to be pretty. Some of it's just designed to work really, really well. Then there's the Kea. I have to be honest with you, this is the one that tends to steal the show, regardless of what else is on in the itinerary. It's the only alpine parrot in the world, found nowhere else but our Southern Alps, and it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most intelligent birds on the planet. Here solve puzzles, cooperate with each other, and have an insatiable curiosity that gets them, and unfortunately your car, into constant trouble. They've got personality to boot. I call this photo Jon Snow. It reminds me of Game of Thrones. They've been known to strip the rubber trim off vehicles simply because they can, not because they're hungry, purely because it's interesting and possibly fun. Meeting a Kia, it feels less like a wildlife encounter and more like being sized up by something that's already three steps ahead of you and rather enjoying itself. And finally, along the coast, our seals and sea lions. New Zealand seals were actually hunted to the edge of extinction and are now recovering strongly. They're the ones you're almost guaranteed to see, hauled out on rocky shorelines right along our coastline, diving for squid and fish by night and sunning themselves lazily by day. You'll get close, comfortable views of these on the trip. Sea lions, though, are a different story. The New Zealand sea lion is actually the rarest sea lion species on Earth, and seeing one is genuinely special. It's not something I can promise you. It is something that we will try to see and will be watching for. If we're lucky enough to see one, it is not an animal to be trifled with. A big male such as this can weigh as much as 400 kg and move a great deal faster over sand than you'd actually expect. We keep our distance and we let them dictate the encounter, and we will never approach a mum with a pup. For decades, the species vanished entirely from the mainland, pushed back to a couple of remote subantarctic islands hundreds of kilometres south. Then, in 1993, one pregnant female swam over 400 kilometres north and hauled out onto an Otago beach. Locals nicknamed her Mum, and every sea lion pup born on that stretch of the coast since traces all the way back to her. One animal that decided to come home and restart an entire mainland population. If we're fortunate enough to spot one of her descendants from a respectful distance, we'll be looking at something very few visitors to this country ever get to see. So what does this actually look like day to day? Let me paint you the picture. There are only 6 of you on the tour, supported by 2 guides, myself and David. And that gives you plenty of space on the boats without ever feeling crowded. And it means genuinely personal attention rather than a bus tour with cameras. Everything we do is built around one rule. The animals come first, always. We don't approach, we don't crowd, we don't do anything that changes an animal's behaviour for the sake of a photograph. The pace itself is unhurried. This isn't a checklist tour where we're rushed from stop to stop on a rigid clock. We move with the wildlife. If the wildlife is active and the light's good, we're going to stay longer. And that built-in time isn't only for photography. There are optional bookable experiences that you can add in, like swimming with wild dolphins, or you can simply rest and relax, whatever suits you on the day. You don't need to be an experienced photographer to get everything out of this either. Whether you're on your first camera or your 5th, the pace and guidance are built to really work for you. A typical day starts early. We're out at first light because that's when the light in the wildlife will be at their best. From there, we either travel on towards the next location in time for a sunset shoot, or if we're staying put, then that's your window for one of the other excursions. We travel together in a dedicated minivan with a driver, so nobody's worrying about logistics. And at 3 of our sites, we'll be out on boats specifically for the wildlife that we can only reach by water. Over the trip, the focus was going to be penguins, seabirds, the kea, tuatara, forest birds, alongside also landscape. I will flag, we don't actually have time in the itinerary for a reliable Kiwi encounter. They are a little bit further south or up north. But if that interests you, speak to me directly. I'm happy to help build an extension onto that trip. Accommodation will be comfortable rather than flashy, as we'll often be staying in small towns. However, you'll each have your own room with kitchen access if you'd like to put together your own breakfast or lunch. We stop at supermarkets, also at cafes along the way for exactly that. And on one day, we may even have time to pop by a local vineyard. Dinners are included throughout. And even though this is a wildlife focused trip, we're always still going to pull over for iconic landscape shots as we travel between locations. After all, this is New Zealand, and you're not going to want to drive straight past some of these sites at all. This tour runs for the first time in October 2027 and will continue running each year then on. I picked that month deliberately after working on the design of this tour for a number of years. New Zealand will be slowly moving into spring, and it's the optimum time for sightings. We get the best chance of snow, hopefully still lingering for the kea in the high country, and many of the species we're focused on are just beginning to mate and nest, which gives us the best possible chance of real sightings and behaviour, not just animals sitting quietly out of season. So, if anything you've seen today has caught your imagination,